Good day, fellow investors, and I want to welcome you to this week's podcast. Glad to have you aboard as I'm doing this podcast and looking out the window. Snow is starting to fall here in the heartland for one of the first times this year, so kind of nice to see. Kind of a nice setting today, especially sky's a little bit gray. Nice slow snowfall. We're into December, so nice look that I'm getting outside my window anyway as I'm spending my time with you here from the heartland with this week's podcast. And I've got what I really like to talk about, and I'm talking subject matter, and a lot of what I spend my time doing is talking to people and giving them my opinion on what they should be looking for when it comes to investing, especially, of course, when it comes to investment real estate. What you should be looking for, what you should be thinking about, what you should be analyzing, what you should be paying more attention to versus other things, etc., etc. However, I probably spend the second most, I guess the way I would say it would be, probably the second highest use of my time is talking to investors, not only to individual investors, but companies, investment groups, partnerships, etc., about what to avoid. What kind of property should they be avoiding? What kind of property should we be avoiding as investors when it comes mainly to residential real estate? So I'm talking apartments is mainly what I'm talking about. And just because I am really, really high on apartments right now and think that's a place where everybody, if you've got investable monies, regular money, IRA, etc., some of it at least has to be in apartments. Right now, especially with what is going on socially, economically, especially from a technology standpoint, and those are things I've covered and probably will continue to cover and go over here and there again. But for our conversation, our podcast today, I want to spend some time talking to you about apartment properties, rental real estate properties that I recommend you avoid. Okay. And let me start out with a couple of real quick ones because I've already mentioned them in previous podcasts. One is, as you know, I'm not a big fan of single-family homes as an investment. And by the way, they're not bad. I just don't think they're as good as apartments at the end of the day. So let's just cross that one off our list right now. Let's cross it off. And if you had not listened to my explanation on why I have that opinion, then you may want to go back and listen to the podcast I recently had, which was basically single-family homes versus apartments, what you should look for. So there's that. Another one that I'll cross off the list real quick, because it's been part of podcasts that I've had in the past, is in most cases, not all, but most cases, you want to avoid new construction. Okay? You want to avoid new construction. The exceptions would be in hot marketplaces where there's lines out the door of prospective renters. All the apartments are full. There's waiting lists 2 miles deep. I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, but you get the picture. If you're in a marketplace like that, the new construction probably makes some sense. But if you're in the average, I just say average to even above average market where occupancy rates are strong, renting is strong, economy is good, and everything's actually, let's just say average to above average economically, especially when it comes to renting apartments. You still want to stay away. You only really want to look at new construction if things are just the pent-up demand is so huge that it makes sense in looking at doing that. Otherwise, it can be full of risk and risk that you want to avoid. So those are the first. Let's just get those out of the way right now. So let's do that. So we've done that. Now, let's hit the common sense things real quick before we jump into specific property types, okay? Let's have a little common sense conversation between us on this podcast, so to speak. So if I'm looking at an apartment property and the area that it's in has boarded up houses, boarded up properties, for rent or for lease signs on commercial properties that have broken windows, the buildings are dilapidated, properties are not well kept or maintained, it's just driving through, you like, no, okay, that this isn't really the place to be. Let's call that common sense, because it really is. Then you pretty much want to avoid that area or that property, no matter what the property's like. Big, small, fat, tall, doesn't matter. If the area is on a decline, and especially if it's a large amount of what I would call like the concentric circle approach, which is, within like quarter mile, half a mile radius, maybe even larger, and everything around there is just looking really, really rough, then of course you want to be rethinking the prospect of owning a property in that area. Okay. And the thing that you've got to put aside when it comes to some of this is your natural inclination to want to help people. Okay. Unfortunately, in most cases, your inclination to help and to be, I guess I'll use the word charitable, does not enter into the investment equation and should not. So you shouldn't be buying apartments in rundown, economically plagued areas because you want to help people. If you do, and that's the mission, and you don't care about return on your investment, God bless you, go for it. Good for you. But if not, you don't want to do that. Okay. And so that is an example of just kind of using common sense in avoiding a piece of apartment property, rental property, because you cannot change the area. I'm going to talk more about that, and I'm going to talk to you about a huge mistake that I made personally that cost me lots of money regarding that here in just a little bit, because it will it'll be a good tie-in with one of the last kind of properties I recommend you avoid. Okay, so let's start with the list. Here's my list. Number one, conversions. You want to avoid conversions. Now, what do I mean by conversions? I'm talking about big single-family homes that were once 2-story, 3-story, homes, grand homes that have since been, converted to, a fourplex, an 8-unit building, 12 sleeping rooms, those kinds of things. You want to avoid those, and that's number one on my list for a reason, because it's the biggest kind of property you want to avoid. And here's why. They are very alluring. Okay, what do I mean by alluring? Well, usually those kinds of properties that are the converted single-family home are priced much, much less than, let's say, your typical garden-style apartment property. So the price is a hell of a lot lower. And when you start working the numbers, when you run the numbers, it looks fantastic. So it's not uncommon to run numbers on these properties and be in the 15 to 20% return range. Okay, not uncommon at all. And so just to give you an idea, the other day I had a conversation with a gentleman who owns such a property, asked me if I had an interest in buying it, as a matter of fact. And I said, no way. And so he told me exactly what I had found out over the years about how these properties work. And it goes back to being very alluring, very attractive. You look at the numbers and you'd think you've got to be an idiot not to invest in something like this. Look at the returns. Here's the big thing to keep in mind on these kind of properties. There's actually two things. Two main things, then there's a few what I would call kind of sub-points I want to make. Number one is the properties never work out like you think they're going to financially. They never do, ever. So let's say you're looking at a 6-unit, big 2-story conversion. House was built in 1905. In 1945, it was converted into 6 units. And so, it's the house with 6 separate apartments in it now. Okay. If you get your financials out and you factor in, well, if I get rent from all the units and here's what the rent is, here's what my expenses are, here's what I'm left over with. If you do that, again, you're going to be looking at 15 to 20% returns all day, right? So you're probably asking the question, at least to yourself, well, why in hell wouldn't we look at this? Because of what I just said. The financials never work out. So with these kinds of properties, they are never fully occupied. And if by chance they are, the chances that the residents that choose to live in such places, the chances that they will all pay rent on time and not have any kind of issues in paying rent, you're naive to think that that's going to be the case. So if you think you buy one of these properties and A, you'll be fully occupied all the time, and B, even if you are occupied, full or not, that you will have the kind of residents that will gladly be paying you rent on whenever it's due, let's say the 1st of every month, you are sadly mistaken. It's not going to happen. Okay, why is that? Well, these kinds of properties more than likely, in most cases, attract the kind of residents that are let's just say less responsible with their finances. Okay, they're less responsible, so their problems become your problems most of the time. They got laid off at their job. Their boss doesn't like them. Grandma forgot to send money this month. Their disability check got lost in the mail. I mean, I could sit here until 6 o'clock tonight, 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, doesn't matter, and go over every excuse I've seen or heard regarding this. And so the income is not there with these properties. Never will be there. It will never be like you think it should be. Ordinarily, you'd think, hey, if I got 6 units rented, they should all be paying rent on time, and I can count that as rental income. Yeah, ordinarily, but you're not talking about an ordinary kind of property. So that will not happen. And the kind of resident that you will attract to that kind of property will be more apt to be irresponsible, dysfunctional, and you'll have to babysit the heck out of them just to get paid. And that is not only just to get paid on time, but to get paid the full rent that you're owed. Most of the properties that I've looked at that fall into this category, almost all, always have residents living in them that are 1, 2, 3 months behind. There's some weird payment arrangement. The guy in apartment 7 pays by the week. And then, when his special check comes, then he pays a little bit more that week than another. I mean, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a nightmare. Avoid it. Okay? Avoid it, because even though on paper it looks logically like it should work out, it doesn't. So let's switch to the expenses of those kinds of properties, okay? And I could really go a lot of different ways with what I'm going to tell you about expenses with these kind of properties, but I'm just going to summarize it to you in this way. And what I'll tell you is that the expenses are always, always, always more than what you think they're going to be with these converted houses. Always. Let me just put it to you this way. Do you think it costs more to maintain and repair and take care of apartment turnover with a property built in 1910 that was originally built as a house, or a garden-style apartment property built in 1985? Right? That pretty much tells you that's the case. And so the expense numbers are almost always slanted towards being way, way, way low because of the money you will end up spending after you own the property. Okay? After you own the property. And so not only that, because of the age, repairs, maintenance, things just take a lot longer many times because a lot of things that need to be done, with the exception of your general repairs, you've got old stuff in there, right? You got old things that need to be considered, and more on this in a little bit too, by the way. But so you want to stay away from them because the expenses are always much, much higher. And so really what ends up happening is, on paper, these kind of properties look like the investor's dream. 15, 20% returns, probably more. I can get it for $100,000 or less. I'm not spending a lot of money in buying it. And the list goes on. But what I'm telling you is it is never, ever, ever as good as it looks on paper at all. And then the last thing, and I won't spend a lot of time on it regarding these kind of properties, is resale. The resale absolutely sucks on these kind of properties because most people are out looking to buy something, and they're looking to buy an apartment property built as an apartment property in a average to above average area with an average to above average tenant mix. Sounds reasonable, right? That's what most people are looking for when they're looking to buy multifamily property. Not a lot of people are looking to buy the converted house that was built in the early 1900s in a older, more mature area of the city. Okay, so your resale suffers. In other words, you don't get much appreciation. And I've seen properties like this get no appreciation over years because of that. So little or no appreciation. Your expenses are extremely high or higher than you think. There's a surprise every month. And the income that comes in is not consistent. So run away from them. Don't buy them. Stay away from converted houses. Now, there's one exception to this. One. Only one. And that is if these houses are right across the street from a college or university. Okay. And so students will rent most anything. And I'm not condoning what I'm going to say here, but the apartment can have rats, cockroaches all over the place. Maybe hasn't been cleaned in 15 years. There's a smell of a dead cat in the closet. Guess what? It's across the street from the university. It's going to get rented. That's just the way it goes. So that would be about the only exception to what I've mentioned to you, because you can get enough money and the income is a little more consistent. And even though your expenses will be high, you'll be getting so much more money renting that as close as it is to college or university than you would the typical converted house, that in many cases it actually does make sense. But it's rare. But that would be about the only exception. Okay? All right. Let's jump to number two. Number two. And that is stay away from any kind of apartment property. And I'm talking conventional or conversions in a small town. Do not buy any kind of investment real estate, any kind of apartments, multifamily investment property in a small town. The town or the city you buy this in has to have some economic vibrancy, some economic activity. If the only thing that exists in town is a convenience store, and that's the biggest business in town, you need to run away from that as quickly as possible. So I'll share a story with you to illustrate the point. Gentleman and I, in 2004, we found a HUD repo property in small town Iowa. Okay? And the price was super cheap. Super cheap. Because it was a all brick 25 unit property that was only 15 years old, sitting on 5 acres of beautiful land next to the highway. And this property had a full kitchen where residents can come in, get something out of the fridge, sit around a table, had a barber shop in it, a library in this building too. Not a big one, a small one, but nonetheless. So you've got this beautiful 25-unit brick apartment building sitting on 5 acres, trees, just beautiful, plus full kitchen. You got a barber shop in the darn thing. You got a library. Nice property. Very, very nice property. So when we took it over, we got all caught up in what I just told you. And how could we lose money on this? As a matter of fact, we're kind of counting the money we were going to make once we bought it. So we ended up buying it. And when we bought it, all the units were empty because HUD had gone ahead and made arrangements to move everybody out prior to the property going into foreclosure and being resold. So it was empty property. 25 units, okay? So we owned this property for 7 years till we sold it. Over a 7-year period, the highest number of units we had occupied at any given time in this 25-unit property was 17. That was it. That was our best month. Our best month. 17 out of 25 units. Most of the time, the property ran with at least 50% vacancy. Okay? Now, in case you think it's the property is the reason why, it's not. Because what I just described to you tells you that this was a nice place. Beautiful place. Nice place to live. Quiet. Good location. But that's just it. It was quiet. Why? Because it was in such a small town that the population was so small and the economic activity was so slow, there was no real apartment rental candidates available at really any given time. Okay? There just wasn't. Why? Because nobody really wanted to live there. That's why. Most people did not want to live there. And here's the problem with small towns. If they're far away from a larger town or city with a lot of economic activity, that's where it really punches you in the gut. Okay? So this town that I'm talking about, this property that we purchased, was about 40 miles away from a city that had any kind of economic vibrancy. So what ended up happening, not surprisingly, is when, when people wanted to go shopping or get their groceries or, and be entertained, go out for entertainment, et cetera, they'd all leave town and then they'd come back. But it's 40 miles away. And so we ended up owning this for 7 years, and we ended up selling it for only about, I'd say maybe 3 or 5% more than what we paid for it 7 years prior. And when we bought it for such an unbelievably low price, you would be shocked at what we bought it for. So much for the ideas of how much money is going to be made on that investment. Lesson learned. Lesson is this. Small towns, stay away from them. Do not buy properties in small towns, especially those that hardly have any economic activity, because what drives the value of your property is actually getting it rented, and rented at reasonable enough rents so that the income stream will not only give you a nice income, it will increase the value of the property over time. Small towns, especially really small ones, are not capable of doing that. I had another friend of mine that purchased a 14-unit property in small town, Missouri. Okay, fully occupied when he bought it, and so he was making about a 14 to 16% return on his money the first year and a half he owned it. This thing was just cranking out, doing great for him. All of a sudden, they stopped. They finished constructing they were building some plant about, 30, 45 minutes away. And so the construction crew, most of those guys that worked on that crew to build this plant, Their jobs are done. They're gone. So he goes in 1 month. He goes from a 14-unit building fully occupied to having 3 units occupied, the rest vacant. I guess you could kind of call it a see-through apartment building. Year and a half later, he ended up getting foreclosed on and had to go back to the bank. Okay, why? Because of the small town. So don't make the same mistake. Stay away from small towns. So that's number 2. Number 3, and I've touched on this a little bit in number 1 regarding the conversions, but there are some properties that aren't conversions either. They are built as apartment properties that do fall into this category, and I've ran into quite a few of them over the years. You really want to think about staying away from any kind of apartment property built before 1970. Okay. Now, I'm not saying you stay away from all of them. The older, the further away from 1970 they are, the more you want to stay away from them. Okay, so let's talk about really quickly about the obvious reasons, and then I want to give you a couple reasons that aren't so obvious, which actually trumps the obvious reasons. So obvious reasons, of course, are age, repair, and maintenance costs. The older a property is, the more it's going to cost to repair and maintain. Okay, that's pretty, I think all of us pretty much know that. No matter what kind of shape it's in, by the way, it's just going to cost more money. And sure, you can say we can build that into the price, and maybe we can, maybe you can't. But a lot of times, especially if there's no more parts for stuff, you got to start over with things. So we just had an incident where we have a few apartments that we own that were built in the late 60s. Okay, and we've not run into much issues with these. They've actually performed well over the years, except we've got a couple key pieces of electrical boxes that need to be probably replaced here pretty soon. Well, guess what they don't make anymore? That's right, they don't make the breakers for these boxes because they're so old. So now, instead of just getting some breakers replaced here and there, now it looks like we may have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars more to upgrade for lack of a better way of describing it, a new electrical system. Why? Because the building was built in late 1960s. Okay. So you don't want to get in that kind of position. So what I've told you there, that's pretty logical, right? Now, pretty obvious. Let's talk about something that's not so obvious. The older the property is, the more likely it could be in what I would call a government-controlled area. And I'm not talking government rent subsidy area right now. I'm talking city or state historical government. So you may have a city that has defined a historic district. You may have a county that's defined maybe a historical district. The state might do the same thing. And you can even go as far as a property being on the National Register of whatever, historic register, etc. Okay. You want to avoid any kind of apartment properties that are that old, because any kind of thing you want to do to the property, you want to do a painting job, you want to do a simple repair, you want to make a cosmetic change, anything you want to do, you're going to be regulated, and I'm using that word, regulated, by people that have no experience as apartment property owners, telling you if you can or can't make those changes. So I'll give you an example. I had a client of mine that owned an apartment property, built as an apartment property, solid brick, masonry and steel. I mean, this thing was like 10 nuclear bombs could fall in this darn thing, and it'd probably just be still standing there. That's what kind of shape this thing was in. And so he wanted to start doing some painting in the common areas, and he also wanted to do some painting on the exterior in those places that were not covered with brick. Okay, there were some areas like under windows and maybe in around doors and things that weren't brick that he wanted to take care of. What he found out was he needed permission from some state historical association or society or whatever to do that. And so what happened was, what he found out was they told me, they said, hey, oh, by the way, no, you can't paint that. And then when I'm talking the exterior work, you can't paint that. Here's what you have to do to it to maintain its historical significance. What ended up happening? Repairs cost him 3 times more than what they should have. Interior. They were telling him what kind of paint he could use to paint the interior. Okay. Imagine somebody that has nothing to do with your property, with any of the money you have invested in it, any of the time that you're spending on it, telling you what you need to do to the building in order to improve it. Right? That's what older properties fall victim to. And that's something that I recommend you stay away from. Okay? Make sure you do. All right. Number 4. And then I've got one more after this, actually. So let's go to number 4. And this is actually a short one, and it piggybacks a little bit on what I started out with in terms of common sense. When I'm talking about, if it's an obviously economic blighted area, the area is blighted economically, I mean, you got to run away. And this is the case, number 4, this is even the case if you find a property that's just absolutely beautiful. Okay? Absolutely beautiful, gorgeous, in great condition. So, most of the time when we think of, let's just say an economically blighted area, you've got a picture in your mind of what the real estate looks like, right? And that real estate in your mind, the picture you've got, it's not sparkling. I mean, you're thinking about buildings falling down, in bad shape, peeling paint, boarded up windows. So that's pretty much what you're thinking. Okay, but what if you're in that area and all of a sudden you see a beautiful 24-unit apartment building right in the middle of all this? Great shape, beautiful, looks fantastic. What would you think then? Would you think, this might be something? And what if you could get it at an unbelievably low price? How tempted would you be now? Well, I'll tell you that happened to me. And contrary to the advice that I give you now, a partner and I decided we're going to do this anyway. We're a couple of really smart guys. We really know what we're doing. We've got so much experience with this. And you can't beat the price that we're going to get this property at. So we're going to buy this property. And this is going to turn out to be a great investment. So literally, we bought the most beautiful property in the crappiest area of the city, is really what we did. Okay. So what happened? We owned it for 4 years and sold it at a substantial loss. A substantial loss. What happened? Well, here's the thing about really, really nice properties. And it's, even if they're really nice, but if they're in an economic blighted area, the only kind of resident you're going to attract is a resident that doesn't have a problem living in an economically blighted area. Common sense, right? Well, wish I would have thought of that and had that discussion with myself, with my partner before we bought it, because you don't really think that way at the time. Right? You think beautiful property. We're going to have, beautiful property equals good tenants. Good property equals good tenants. No. This was really, really brought home to me one day when I was at the property and I'm talking with our resident manager, having a visit with him. And at the time I had a visit, he got a phone call from a prospective tenant. And the phone call was basically, hey, I'm not quite sure where you're at. I thought you were on Jones Street. I'm over here on Jones. And so him and I walk out of his management office outside to the street while he's on his cell phone guiding this prospective tenant to the property. So, she can get there and he can show her an apartment. And so if you kind of picture in your mind's eye, him and I are standing out there. He's on the phone, guiding her and turn right there and turn left here. All of a sudden we see this car coming down the road. And it pulls up next to the property. We start walking over because we think it's the resident, and she says she's here. All of a sudden, she takes off and just takes off down the street. Never got out of her car. While she's still on the phone with my resident manager, she says, I'm sorry, I've already decided I don't want to rent this apartment. I'm not really excited about the area that it's in. Thank you for the opportunity. Goodbye. So when you have prospective residents pulling up, looking at the area, even though the property's in great shape, and then squealing the tires and leaving, that kind of tells you something, right? So here we've got a really nice property, but the only kind of residents we can attract are residents that do not have a problem in living in an economically blighted area. Don't you do the same thing, okay? Stay away from those kind of properties and those kind of temptations, because what really tempts you on those is the price. You know, geez, you can buy it for so much less than what you ever thought you could, and you think to yourself, how could this really go wrong? Especially if I'm a pretty smart person. How could this really go wrong? Well, if you do what I just told you not to do, it will go wrong. Believe me. Believe me, it will. So, all right, let's hit the last one. And the last one is commercial properties that have been converted to residential. So I'm talking, you know, a really hot thing, and it's not so hot anymore, but you still see it. For a while there in mid to late 2000s, even after 2010, you saw quite a bit of commercial properties being converted to residential, didn't you? You know, the big warehouse property that's been sitting empty, now we're going to make it into loft apartments, right? Or, you know, the big manufacturing facility, you know, we're going to take part of that and we're going to make a couple of those buildings and convert those into apartments or condominiums. Warehouses, you've seen it happen as well. So it's not anything that's new, and it's been around for a while. I don't think you see as much activity with this as you used to, but nonetheless you do. And if there's any kind of investment property you want to avoid, it's these because of that. So you're talking about buying a property that was once commercial, bringing in a whole crew of maintenance and repair folks to make it into residential. And if you think you're not going to have any issues with that property afterwards, once again, you're naive, because you will. Those kinds of conversions continually have issues, maintenance and repair issues especially. And then there's housing code issues that continually get changed over time. That can really, really get in the way. And so it's expensive to own them. They're expensive to buy because of the amount of money you have to pay after, you know, whomever does the conversion. You know, they want to make their money back and a little money on top of that. So you end up paying a lot of money for them, and they just hardly ever end up working out financially the way that you think, because of the continuous and constant issues that always come up as a result of the darn conversion. Okay, I've seen this happen a lot. And it's something you want to avoid. There is one exception to this, okay? The exception would be the property, but it was converted a minimum of 10 to 20 years ago, okay? Why do I say that? Because over about, let's say 20 years, over 20 years, a lot of those bugs, I'll call them, should have been fixed and taken out. Okay, all those bugs should be fixed by then. Okay, so in other words, somebody else has taken on the responsibility of fixing all the stuff that's come up. And if you've got a project that's, let's say, 20 years old, that might be a decent project to look at, because most of the bugs should have already been taken care of that would pop up over that period of time. Okay, I've been involved in quite a few conversions like that, where they used to be a kind of property. They were converted into apartments, but they were converted 20, 25 years ago. And so the amount of repair or maintenance or housing code or any of those kinds of surprises is minimal now. because all that stuff has been worked out over the years. Okay, it's actually the newer ones is where the most concern of mine comes from. Plus, for an older property, you're paying less for it anyway versus a newer one, aren't you? Okay, so that pretty much wraps up my opinion of apartment or residential investment real estate, multifamily, that you want to avoid. Those are on the top of my list. And I'll close with just another quick story just to illustrate. I had a guy that contacted me, and he wasn't a client, but he wanted to be. And he contacted me and said that he had an opportunity to buy a duplex in place, doesn't matter where it's at, to buy a duplex in the U.S. For $13,000. Each side of this duplex, which both of them had 3-bedroom units, were renting for $750 a month. So if you do like the quick math, even after you pay expenses, $13,000, you should be getting that money back as quickly as possible, right? I mean, that sounds like a no-brainer, doesn't it? $13,000, they each rent for $750 a month. How can you not win on that? So he told me he was going to buy it. I told him that he needed to do all of the kind of due diligence items that actually we've discussed on this podcast. Okay. Check the area, check the property, have it inspected, look into the tenants, all those kinds of things. Well, of course, he did none of that because the price was so low. So he buys it. In less than a year, he's got it for sale. In less than a year, he sold it for $5,000. Okay? Why? Because of everything that I just told you on this podcast. Okay? Everything I just told you on this podcast. And I end with this story because with all of the kind of properties that I've mentioned to avoid, the single biggest temptation to buying them is going to be price. Okay? Because you're going to think to yourself, how can you lose on that? How can something go wrong if I invest that much money? I mean, that's cheap. Yes. But always remember the old adage that hopefully you've heard, and I'm sure you've heard it many times. And it basically is, if it looks too good to be true, more than likely, that's right, it is. Okay. So I appreciate you being with me on this week's podcast. As always, I always love to get feedback, communication from my members on your thoughts. Maybe you've got a story that you want to share with me regarding a similar kind of situation or something close to what I've talked about on today's podcast. If you do, I would love to hear from you. It'd be great. Either send me an email or get on our website and contact me that way. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you and hear from you and hear about your experiences. Okay. So thank you for joining me on today's podcast, everybody. Have a great day. Make it a good one, and we will be talking to you, I'm sure, very, very soon. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you. Bye-bye.